Welcome back to the CSO Strategy Brief. My name is Paul Hunter. A few years from now, somebody is going to look like a genius. Somebody else, though, is going to look as though they completely misread the future. At least that's how the story will probably be told. Today, though, things are not nearly so clear. Across the automotive industry, some of the world's largest companies are making enormous commitments based on remarkably different interpretations of the future. Tesla sees one path, BYD appears to see another. Toyota has consistently argued that the future may be more complex than many people assume. What's interesting is that they're all observing broadly the same environment. They're seeing many of the same technologies emerge, they're watching similar regulatory developments, they're monitoring the same broad shifts in customer behaviour, yet they're placing very different bets. That raises a fascinating question. How do intelligent organisations, looking at many of the same signals, arrive at such different conclusions? The easy answer is that some of them are right and some of them are wrong. Perhaps one day that will prove true, but I don't think that's the most interesting way to think about it. The more interesting possibility is that they're all trying to navigate a world in which several futures appear plausible simultaneously. And that creates a very different challenge. It's no longer about seeing change. The problem is deciding which interpretation of change deserves commitment. Imagine being part of the executive team of a major automotive manufacturer. The evidence doesn't arrive neatly organised into one obvious conclusion. Instead, it arrives at a collection of signals. Some suggest electrification will accelerate rapidly, others suggest adoption may take longer than expected, some point towards battery electric dominance. Others leave room for hybrids, hydrogen, or combinations of technologies that are still evolving. Viewed individually, many of these signals appear reasonable. Taken together, they create ambiguity. And ambiguity is where strategy starts becoming difficult. But we have seen this pattern before. Digitalisation was discussed long before it transformed the way organisations operated. Cloud computing existed well before most executives were willing to trust it with critical business processes. Artificial intelligence has been the subject of discussion for decades, yet only recently has it become a boardroom priority. Even now, organisations around the world are committing extraordinary amounts of capital to AI infrastructure, while many of the long-term implications remain uncertain. In each case, the signal appeared long before the commitment. The challenge wasn't recognising change. The challenge was deciding when the evidence was sufficient to justify action. That's why I don't think the automotive story is fundamentally about vehicles. It's about commitment. More specifically, it's about what organisations do when multiple futures appear possible at the same time. Because eventually, decisions need to be made. Capital cannot remain unallocated indefinitely. Capabilities cannot remain hypothetical. Resources cannot sit permanently on the sidelines. At some point, leadership teams are forced to choose what they are willing to invest in, what they are prepared to strengthen, and just as importantly, what they may need to move away from. What makes the situation particularly difficult is that those decisions don't remain abstract for very long. They begin reshaping the organisation itself. A decision about a technology platform influences investment priorities. Investment priorities influence capability development. Capabilities influence organisational intention, and over time, the organisation starts becoming better at pursuing some possibilities than others. What began as a strategic preference gradually becomes organisational reality. That reality might include new facilities, new partnerships, new expertise, and new operating models. Equally, it may involve retiring older capabilities, closing facilities, withdrawing from historic investments, or redefining what the organisation believes it is good at. That's when strategy becomes tangible, not when a presentation is approved, but when resources start moving. And perhaps that's where many discussions about strategy become misleading. We often focus on the quality of the decision itself. What is right? What is wrong? Should they have invested more? Should they have waited? But those questions often overlook a larger issue. The real challenge is rarely the initial commitment. The real challenge is what happens after the commitment has been made. The reasoning? A commitment creates capability. That's its purpose. New knowledge is acquired and new systems are developed. That leads to the formation of new relationships and then new investments that have to be justified. The organisation becomes increasingly capable of pursuing a particular future, but there is another side to the story. As capabilities accumulate, flexibility begins to diminish, not because anyone deliberately chose rigidity, but because successful organisations naturally become organised around the things they do well. The stronger those capabilities become, the harder they are to move. This is one reason successful organisations occasionally find themselves struggling with change. Not because they failed to see what was happening, not because their leaders lacked intelligence, but because success itself created commitments that became progressively harder to reposition. Examples include factories, supplier ecosystems, engineering disciplines, performance systems, entire ways of thinking about value creation. All of them become embedded over time, and embedded resources do not move easily. And this challenge becomes particularly visible in capital-intensive industries. A software company can often adjust direction relatively quickly. An automotive manufacturer just can't. Its resources are tied to assets that may take years to develop, decades to fully utilise. The same capabilities that create competitive strength can also slow strategic movement. In a sense, the organisation becomes increasingly committed to its own success model. That observation reminded me of something from the strategic agility literature. The researchers argued that agility doesn't come from a single capability. Instead, it emerges from the interaction of three factors. The first is strategic sensitivity. That's the ability to recognise important developments early and understand their significance. The second is leadership unity. This relates to the ability of leaders to form a coherent view and act without becoming trapped by internal politics. The third is resource fluidity, and that's the ability to redeploy resources quickly when circumstances change. What strikes me is that most organisations don't fail because they're weak in all three. Many are perfectly capable of recognising change, and many leadership teams eventually reach agreement about what needs to happen. The real difficulty often emerges when resources have to move, because moving resources is much harder than moving ideas. Capital has to be redirected, and capabilities have to be developed. New capabilities. Old investments may need to be reconsidered. New priorities must compete with established ones. And the larger the organisation, the more difficult that process often becomes. Perhaps that's a deeper issue hiding inside the automotive industry. The public discussion focuses on technologies, battery electric vehicles, hybrid, hydrogen, but underneath those debates sits another question entirely. Can organisations reposition themselves quickly enough to keep pace with the environment around them? Because the challenge is not merely adapting to change, the challenge is adapting quickly enough. And this may be where adaptation and invention begin to diverge. Adaptation helps organisations respond to changes that have already become visible. Invention, previously described as prosponse, is different. It involves building capabilities around possibilities before they become obvious. One is primarily concerned with responding to reality. The other is concerned with helping create it. The strongest organisations appear to be capable of both. This is one reason companies such as BYD have become so interesting. Not because we know their strategy will ultimately prove superior. We don't. The story is still being written. What's interesting is that they behave as though a particular future deserved commitment and spent years building capabilities around that belief. Whether history eventually rewards that judgment is almost secondary. The commitment itself changed what the organisation was capable of becoming. The more I think about it, the more I suspect that strategic agility is really a race. Not against competitors, but between the speed of environmental change and the speed at which an organisation can reposition itself. If conditions are changing faster than resources can move, organisations begin to fall behind. Not because they're unaware or because they are unintelligent, but because the environment is evolving faster than their capacity to adapt, invent and redeploy. So perhaps the most interesting question raised by Tesla, BYD and Toyota is not which company is right. The more interesting question is how organisations maintain the ability to move when several futures remain possible, because that's increasingly the challenge facing leaders everywhere. Rarely certainty, rarely clarity. More often a series of competing possibilities, each demanding attention, resources and belief. There's a little bit about trust in there as well. The organisations that thrive won't necessarily be those that predict the future most accurately. They'll be the organisations that remain capable of sensing change, forming judgments and repositioning resources while the future is still emerging. And let's face it, the future is always emerging. Because the greatest strategic risk may not be making the wrong commitment. It may be discovering that the world is changing faster than the organisation's ability to move. And that takes us to our next conversation. Why do some organisations spend enormous energy changing, yet somehow remain fundamentally the same? And why do others seem capable of continual renewal? We'll explore that next time. Thank you again for listening. And again too, my name, Paul Hunter.